I'm Joshua, and I'm an INTP, and first and foremost, I would like to say thank you for viewing this video, and subsequently visiting my channel. The topic of this video is going to be on Nietzsche's idea, the Overman, and the reason I want to talk about this video is, talk about this concept in this video is because on many videos and forums about the advent of AI and the advent of transhumanistic technology, many people are saying that the transhumanist or the singularity is going to be the dawn of the Overman. And these people are fools as far as I'm concerned, because they don't really understand Nietzsche, nor what he was saying and why AI, nor can a transhuman be Nietzsche's ideal of the Overman. Now, the reason why people may misunderstand this is because Nietzsche is quite honestly a tricky philosopher, in the sense that he did not write things that were easily understood by merely, I suppose, reasoning within the context of philosophical tradition. So in order to understand Nietzsche, you have to understand Greco-Roman tradition. You have to understand the changes that happen in Europe in terms of the advent of merchants and the shortening hands of power of the aristocracies and monarchs of the past, and the ways in which Nietzsche interpreted these things to be the downfall of the psychological and genetic legacy of mankind. It's why Nietzsche is probably one of the first and real eugenicists of the modern age, of modernity. And so I'd like to talk about that, because even if I don't agree with everything that Nietzsche says, I think that his arguments are important, and they should not be bastardized and misrepresented in certain kinds of ways, because the first thing that people have to understand is Nietzsche was fundamentally a humanist. Nietzsche's greatest concern and interest was seeing the proliferation of mankind, but Nietzsche did not see all as equal in the fraternity of mankind. And what I mean by that is when Nietzsche just didn't see that all things, all people were worth, or that all existence was worth or appropriate, was worth being a part of this world, or our cultures and our systems of things, or were appropriate in making decisions for others or leading any kind of popular movement, being leaders, or our figures of lawgivers and lawmakers. Now, Nietzsche thought these things for several reasons. Mostly, it's to say that, well, I'll say there are some real reasons for Nietzsche's argument, in the sense that it used to be for a very long time that when you looked at population densities, that the population densities tended to favor the rich, the monarchs, the aristocrats, the upper middle class, and middle class. So when you looked at children had per household, necessarily, you would find that most of the people that were having children were people with a good deal of wealth, or a good deal of resources, primarily because the world had far less infrastructure in it, such that the only thing that really could withstand the environment was a robust genetic person. So if you look at people in general, they were more robust as individuals, mostly because they had to do more hard labor and various other more rigorous intellectual tasks. So people, whenever you look at them in terms of our history, they're not very genetically different than us, but you do see a great deal of phenotypic variance happening across our time and our landscape. And I mean, you can just see that from you can just see that in looking at pictures and medical and dental records and various things like that, from all the way from Aborigines people to modern people. Even in this day and age, people who tend to have diets that are higher in root and fiber and various things like that, which are a part of Aborigines people, tend to have better enamel and various things like that, because part of the reason is, and this is where Nietzsche gets his idea of the genetic legacy of mankind, is because human beings are susceptible to the pressures of their environment. So what you do with yourself and what kind of choices you come up with and what the environment demands from you, honestly, is really the best determiner and quality of you. And Nietzsche, being an astute historian, noticed this, that anytime he would look, because Nietzsche very much valued heroes and he very much valued creative geniuses, and so when Nietzsche looked at the ages which produced heroes and creative geniuses, whether or not you're talking about things like the Odyssey, or whether or not you're talking about things like Homer's Iliad and so on and so forth, it was certainly the case that when one looked at the landscape in terms of what constituted human existence, it was pretty harsh, such that not many people or most people didn't make it. And so it left it the case that the people that were present in the world were of what Nietzsche considered higher quality. And it's mostly because of evolution. So natural selection and sexual selection are the mechanisms for which make our being and genetic stock in the world. And Nietzsche put a lot of his stock in these ideas for the mere fact that whenever because Nietzsche studied Darwin and he studied Herbert Spencer mostly, and so he understood Darwin through Herbert Spencer, who was a social Darwinist, and said that is the one that came up with the term, well, survival of the fittest. But Nietzsche didn't consider evolution having a teleos, and he did not see that if it did, that it was necessarily moving human beings to a better end. He didn't think that, because when he looked out at the world in terms of how people were post the Industrial Revolution versus aeons and centuries before, Nietzsche even considered Jesus a great historical triumph or figure. When he looked at the propensity for those types of individuals to emerge in the world, he asked himself, is greatness even possible? And Nietzsche didn't really see greatness being fundamental factors of his age. So he looked back on the rest of the world and saw a degeneration of mankind from a psychological standpoint and a genetic standpoint. And the reason why he saw this is because the Industrial Revolution flattened out a lot of things that used to be natural selective pressures. So it used to be the case, like I said before, that only certain people's children actually made it because they had resources that could buttress them and provide the appropriate environments for them to be nurtured. But I mean, even then, a lot of rich people lost many children, and it's why people had more children back in the day, because many of them and most of them didn't survive. Even for the rich, if you had 13 kids, you were lucky to get 5 or 6 or something like that. Most poor people couldn't afford to have 13 kids, so they'd have 2 to 3 or 4 kids. And I mean, out of those 2 to 3 or 4 kids, most of them died before the ages of 12. And even if you're looking at the upper middle class, if somebody had 3 to 4 kids, man, maybe 1 or 2 of them is making it. And a lot of people see these things and they think in terms of humanitarian sympathies. And so they want to alleviate some of that pain and suffering and the harshness of reality. They want to make the existence of their fellow man something better for them in terms of the solace and let's just say they want to change the world into a place where people can have far more positive meaning when it comes to themselves and the nature of their life and existence. And so Nietzsche definitely didn't. Nietzsche had the same idea, but Nietzsche's idea of what made the world a better place was making it such that mankind would learn how to accept pain and suffering, but not alleviate it. And the reason why he wanted people to accept pain and suffering and not alleviate it is because he thought that that is how you get a great human being, and that's what Nietzsche thought was the best thing for mankind. Because when Herbert Spencer said that the survival of the fittest was the truest expression of human life, Nietzsche couldn't see that, because the thing he saw was a greater influx of people that were, from his estimations, less than or inferior populating societies in the world. Nietzsche saw the proliferation and the rising of the working class person, thanks to Karl Marx. And Nietzsche was not a fan of Marx or Marxism because of that. So part of the reason why Marxism and various things like that occurred was because you did have more working class people. And you did have greater, for a lot of reasons. I mean, once you have the Industrial Revolution, capitalism and commercial ventures can really take off, and it makes it such that there's a greater distribution of wealth in societies, and it makes it such that more people can have jobs and they can get money for themselves, even if they don't work great livings and existences before. Mostly what people did was to live on serf systems and to farm and to do menial tasks and labor and things like that, and they would produce and provide most of their own produce and various things like that. I mean, you were your own, everybody owned their own business. Their life was their business at a point in time, to where now, at that point in time, people, well, people still worked for people, but I mean, it was much more, it was a lot, employment was very different in that day and age than it is now, such that still the bulk of people's efforts and the bulk of people's time and attention was to their own enterprise and their own progeny and children. It's partly why people are selfish now, and they don't really want to give up things now, because we come from people that really made it in the world by being self-interested. I mean, self-interest is kind of the fundamental component to industriousness to some degree. And so that's why Nietzsche also wasn't against self-interest, or why when Ayn Rand talks about the virtue of selfishness, she's just really reciting things that Nietzsche had already covered far before her time. And so when Nietzsche looks out at the world now with respects to the historic landscape, he can't stand what he sees. And so he begins to ask himself, why does this happen? So Nietzsche doesn't necessarily take the evolutionary, he does look at evolution and things like that, but he doesn't take my view on it, nor does he take the economic standpoint on it. And what Nietzsche pays attention to is psychology over time, and what he calls the genealogy of morals, or the creation of values. So what Nietzsche sees society, what holds societies together, is the system of values that underpin their beliefs and actions. And so this is also why Nietzsche didn't like Christianity, because the number one thing that Nietzsche saw in Christianity was that it championed the sick, the infirmed, the weak, and everything that Nietzsche didn't like, basically. And so what Nietzsche saw was that to Nietzsche, Christ was a great man, and he was a great figure. However, what he felt was that Paul was his biggest distorter and mouthpiece, and really brought about the dissolution and destruction of man's capacity for greatness, basically. Because if you read, so Nietzsche grew up in a Methodist household, and he was very pious and Christian as a young man. But Nietzsche had probably read the Bible more times than most people. His father was a preacher and died at a very early age. But Nietzsche, also, when he read those things, because Paul has a lot of lines that make the egalitarian narrative very apparent in Christianity, in the sense that in Christ there is no race, creed, sex, or color, no male or female. All are the same in Christ. So all differences are basically insignificant whenever you're viewing things from the true Judeo-Christian standpoint. So the real Judeo-Christian standpoint is very much socialistic. Contrary to what people may think, because of the Christian West of America, real Christianity is much more socialistic and communistic in its orient than our American version. And so Nietzsche heard this. Part of the reason why the American version changed is because of Nietzsche's criticisms of Christianity, and because of capitalism and a lot of things, man. Like, it's a lot of things. It's complicated history. But the point is, Nietzsche really was not a fan of Christianity for the mere fact that he felt that it was the reason that all things were being depreciated and devalued in the world for man's psychology, because mankind wasn't responsible for its salvation. Salvation now was the responsibility of God himself and his son, like Nietzsche didn't like that idea, because Nietzsche was under the mindset that you're only as great as the weight that you bear and the type of truth that you can accept. So Nietzsche would say that you really only understand how strong someone is, or how great an individual psychology, from the amount of truth and what kind of truth that they can withstand or they can tolerate. So Nietzsche wasn't exactly someone who believed in solace, nor the idea that you make it the responsibility of another person to deal with the issues of another person. So he was not a fan of this idea that you have a savior. In fact, Nietzsche would tell you that there is no savior coming, and Nietzsche really didn't value anybody to look at him as their personal, like, the idea of a personal savior or anybody who's going to save you or do something for you other than yourself was a complete anathema to Nietzsche, because Nietzsche wanted to see the individual become great. Mostly because Nietzsche didn't see so whatever. So that's one thing. So that's what, we'll just stick there. So that's one thing that Nietzsche didn't like. The other thing is that in the Bible, Paul is pretty clear in saying that whenever the Gentiles or the people of this, because they're the New Jerusalem and whatever, but, whenever the people of this world are sacrificing things to their gods or practicing whatever debauchery that they're practicing at any particular time, and you're in some ways feeling as if you're missing out, or they're ridiculing you or harassing you, or you're not advancing in the world in the sense that you're not earning as much as the next person, and you're thinking about getting swept up in the competitive landscape of now, do not pay attention to those things. Your mind is not supposed to be of this world and in this world. Be holy like your Father is holy in heaven, and dwell on heavenly things. Do not dwell on earthly things. Like, it's part of the reason why Christianity has such a dark eschatology, which Nietzsche also probably didn't like, because from his standpoint, and I can definitely agree with this argument, from his standpoint, if you make all fundamental meaning of existence in something that is not in this world, you inevitably depreciate the value of this world, and you inevitably depreciate the value of this world. So any action and anything that occurs in this world is second-hand and inferior to all other divine things. And when you make it the point that, at the end of it all is going to be destroyed, meaning there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth, then you don't have to do anything about really trying to lift a serious weight or really trying to move a serious burden, sacrificing yourself. Nietzsche once said that, and that's part of the reason why Nietzsche liked Christ, because Christ sacrificed himself. Now, Christ was supposed to be the ultimate sacrifice, but Nietzsche asked, when will there be people again that plant trees for 10 years, plant trees or ideas or movements or things that take 10 years or 20 or 50 years to actually emerge or flourish? Most people he saw most people as impatient in the sense that they want to benefit from their labor now, where when he looked at most great people and great men, that's not what they did. Christianity is what it is. It became what it was 100 years after the fact, really. And so, or 50, well, so it depends on when you think the Gospels were written, but, at most generously 50 years after the fact. But really, 100 to 200 years after the fact of the events. And so what Nietzsche certainly thought when he looked out into the world is that the fact that Christianity basically had tied everything up and just gave a way out for people to run away from pain and suffering and the burden of their existence, he saw that as making them weak and making it such that all greatness was cut out from the world. People at this point in time think that, well, they'll just pray or they'll just give all their cares and worries and woes over to God, then the dang thing needs to die, as far as Nietzsche was concerned. Okay. Well, he wasn't the one who killed God. Nietzsche felt like everybody else killed God, but, that was one of his criticisms against Christianity. And then next, Christianity was very much into dealing with the widows, the poor, the old, and the sick. And as Nietzsche saw it from what he considered his naturalistic standpoint, was those are the people that are on their way out. Why do you keep them here? He thought, if you want to be kind to the weak, then make them strong. If you want to, why are you spending your time and wasting your resources, precious resources, on those who are just going to squander it? Nietzsche had the sentiment that, if a tree... Well, Nietzsche just didn't believe all people were equal, and Nietzsche didn't necessarily see death as the worst thing in the world, or a bad thing necessarily, because Nietzsche thought you needed to lose people, you needed to lose bodies, and you had to sacrifice yourself and other things to produce what he considered the Overman. So, he wasn't very big into generosity and charity either, because there is something very real about having very trying circumstances make you rather resilient and individually centered, powerful person. So your capacity to be resourceful, your capacity to be laborious, and your capacity to be, let's just say, resilient. A lot of those things come down to your habits and how you tend to go about doing things in the world. But honestly, from Nietzsche's standpoint, human beings have a sort of nature to them that's in between worm and the Ubermensch, or the Overman, or beast and divine. So when Nietzsche looks at most people, he notices that people don't really like to exert themselves or waste energy, which is true of people. That's true of any animal. But that's not good for any person that really wants to be great, or any person that really wants to do something that's going to be a benefit to themselves and consequently a benefit to other people. So, for example, if you look at any great composer of music, they were pretty intense people. Mozart basically worked himself to death. And Nietzsche preferred an individual like that than an individual who was lazy. And so he definitely saw that people aren't inherently motivated unless they come of a certain kind of temperament, and unless they come up in a certain circumstance that is what he saw a privilege that makes them really, really interested in exhausting themselves, very, very interested in really putting themselves out there and trying to do things that were basically the acts of moving mountains. Dare to be great. That's something that people say nowadays, but that's something that Nietzsche definitely believed. And it's definitely the case that necessity is the mother of invention, and the necessity is the mother of the individual. So Nietzsche saw that people came as certain kinds of things in terms of their nature, but when put in the right circumstances and when they have the right set of values and that leads them to make certain choices, they can fashion themselves into be something that's higher than man, that's just higher than the kind of average bestial nature that most people come with, being slaves to their drives, always being sabotaged by their shadow or their ego or their unconscious. Nietzsche was the first person to really start exploring these things in terms of seeing mankind as a psychological being that was completely physical, that it is your body and your body being in this world and this world acting on you that makes you who and what you are. And you're not just some individual, but you're also a historical creature. And Nietzsche was the first to kind of traverse all of this landscape before Freud and before Jung. And it's the case that his idea of the Ubermensch, now having introduced all of these things, his idea of the Ubermensch was to rewrite or to steer the ship. Well, okay, so back up. So his idea of the Ubermensch comes because Nietzsche proclaims that God is dead, and what he means by that is that all religious ideation and sentiment has receded from the main view of society. So, we don't pray in schools now or anything like that, but it used to be the case that whenever you would walk down the street, let's just say in the height of the Roman Empire, you would see shrines to the gods strewn all about the city, and then those shrines became Christian once Christianity became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. And it was the case that most of your life, outside of its own toil and labor, was devoted to worship and to going to festivals and certain kinds of rituals and dances and all sorts of things with respects to the gods. And most art and media concerned itself depicting the narrative, the mythological narratives that were most salient to individuals' tradition and religious traditions, most certainly. And so when Nietzsche saw that art was starting to become more secular post the Renaissance, and societies were certainly not being run by religious devotion, but commerce and war or profit, basically, Nietzsche saw that there is a growing decline in religiosity and belief. Mostly, too, because what led to the Industrial Revolution was Newton's classical mechanics, or Newton's Newtonian mechanics. And so when Newton basically formulates a view of the world that is so powerful in its predictive validity and leads to the proliferation of so many different kinds of technology, everything from steam engines to electricity and motor-powered vehicles and so on and so forth, I mean, people got the sense that, if there is a God, that's where deism and various things like that come, that's various philosophies or ideologies or beliefs like that come about, because if the universe is basically a clock, then it has no real it's just that there are a lot of things that put a dent in the Judeo-Christian narrative. I mean, all the way from Galileo to Copernicus to Kepler to Newton, our view of the cosmos changed. There weren't spirits and angels pushing around planets anymore. It was a inanimate force. It was a force, and when you realize that there aren't these spirits in the trees wrestling them or moving them or anything like that, or a spirit in the wind that's making it occur, or that the tides are being pulled and swayed by the moon and not by Neptune and things like that. I mean, it kind of dries up all of the mythological or spiritual sap that was in the world that people had interpreted for aeons. I mean, like longer than a lot of other things. We've had gods for longer than we've had most things. And so, when the tendency for belief or interpreting the world in terms of that way drastically declined, as well as Darwin's theory of evolution coming about and man being introduced to the idea that they're not so different or special with respect to other animals within the animal kingdom, that mankind is a part of the animal kingdom. Whoa, holy crap. Like, all ideation in terms of the classical religious thought began to shrink and recede back into the individual. At least that's how Carl Jung puts it. And so when Nietzsche saw this, he was like, holy crap. Because Nietzsche understood mankind to be human beings to be a kind of psychological creature, but Nietzsche basically saw human beings as psychologically weak and unable to cope with the disappearance or the great crater left by the disappearance of God or the death of God. And so Nietzsche basically just said to hell with the rest of the people, to hell with the rest of the people, because they weren't mature enough, but took solace and stock in the idea of creative geniuses, basically. So Nietzsche saw that given the death of God, there would be a type of person that could emerge and greatness could come back into the world, because now the field of suffering and pain basically turned from reality and wars and things like that to the psychological or existential landscape, and from that a new kind of existential or psychological being could be born. But this existential and psychological being would be furnished through discipline and living dangerously, is what Nietzsche calls it. So taking a lot of risk and exerting oneself tremendously on the world to bring about your goals, your aims, and your desires, and being pretty physically robust and taking care of yourself and being a healthy person. Nietzsche valued all of these things, and so as time went on, these individuals, he thought, would go on to be some kind of master class of people, potentially. That wasn't necessarily their end or their goal or anything like that. It was just the case that when Nietzsche saw history play itself out, Nietzsche saw a genius behind all of the turns and twists of history, and that these higher men, or these prototypical Ubermensches were around, they would be the ones that gave law and create the new, or they would give birth to the new gods, if you will. And those gods were in people's values and things like that. Were in the values and the moral precepts that they gave. But Nietzsche didn't see... So what Nietzsche wanted to see was a sacredity of the individual, because Nietzsche saw time and reality as something where, because we're tribal things and we come from tribes, we're so very much about we. And the I was, and the we and the us was always made sacred, but the I, or the individual, it hasn't been made sacred. And because of that, mankind's ailing, and they'll always be suffering from nihilism because the I has never been made sacred, is what his estimations were. And so fundamentally what Nietzsche was saying was that, fundamentally what Nietzsche was most interested in, not what he was saying, fundamentally what he was most interested in was seeing these Ubermensches, or these proto-Ubermensches, or these higher men come about and change mankind's psychological and genetic legacy. So Nietzsche was interested in mankind being a bridge. And when he says a bridge, he literally means the next thing that leads to the other thing for greater and greater individuals to step across from a cultural, psychological standpoint, but also from a biological standpoint. Or the ultimate biological consequence of Nietzsche's, well, there's an ultimate biological consequence to Nietzsche's values, such that as more and more individuals like this appear in the world, the standard for which mankind is, well, the standard of mankind is just lifted, such that people become better and better and better and better and better as time goes on. But he didn't see that as something that was naturally just going to occur without the efforts of these higher men. And one day, the earth and societies, when you have enough higher men and enough time pass, the earth will give itself over to the Ubermensch. Now that's like his speech to combat Christianity, because Christianity says the meek shall inherit the earth, but what Nietzsche said was that the Ubermensch shall inherit the earth, the overman, something that is psychologically, physically, and genetically, psychologically and physically higher than anything, any kind of representation of mankind that came before it. If you buy into transhumanism and if you buy into AI, then you are buying into the idea that pain and suffering ought to be alleviated, or pain and suffering in the world ought to be remediated, that all human beings are equal and all human beings are entitled to certain ways of living just because they're things that feel pain and cry and they have all sorts of other kinds of emotions and feelings. But that is not the kind of idea that Nietzsche had about human beings. I'm not saying that I necessarily agree with him, but I'm saying fundamentally, because of what Nietzsche stood for, his idea of the overman can't be a transhuman, and it can't be AI. I mean, Nietzsche was fundamentally concerned with mankind, and Nietzsche saw the overman being the genetic legacy. Like, man is higher than the ape from Nietzsche's perspective, or man is higher than the chimpanzee. The Ubermensch will be higher than or over man, but it came from man. From a genetic way, from a literal psychological genetic way. Nietzsche, I wouldn't say he was a Luddite or anything like that, but he just didn't care for technology. He didn't care for the modern... Well, I'm not going to say he didn't care for it, but I'm just going to say in the sense, because he had a pretty interesting, fancy little typewriter and various things like that. Nietzsche liked to travel, and he liked staying in nice hotels and things like that. But, and he came from an upper middle class background, but, like, the thing about Nietzsche is that all of these things stopped at a certain point, and the thing that mattered most principally was mankind. And maybe human beings can only be things that really feel as if life has meaning if they are motivated to be in the world from the standpoint that they're creating their greatest way of being, or their greatest mode of being. They're becoming all that they can be. Not to be cliche or anything like that, but to say specifically that if any person found a way to, in a sense, make peace with themselves and express their highest ideals, it'd be hard to see how that person was not someone who was in some way either very much so joyous with their life and very much so magnanimous. I mean, if you look out into the world and ask yourself, how many times do you encounter people that you find utterly just flooring, such that, you know, so Nietzsche was a very interesting person, and one way you can think about what Nietzsche means by being a higher man is Nietzsche believed that higher men were lawgivers, and the context with which he means is, Noah going up to Mount Sinai and receiving the Ten Commandments. When Noah comes back down from Sinai, he's glowing, and his face is ridiculously bright, and everyone is afraid of him. They fear him because, he was in the presence of the Lord, and the presence of the Lord is on him. It's something magnificent, such that people want to bow to Moses, but Moses doesn't allow them to bow to him, and people want to fear Moses like he is the Lord. Well, from Nietzsche's perspective, everything that's great and everything that's good in mankind, all that is wondrous and magnificent, the real majesty and glory is in this body. It's encased in this mind. It's encased in this world. It's literally here, and it's in us. Whenever you come across a person that makes you think like that there's something different or otherworldly about them, well, I would say this: any person that really is the case, that they've made peace with themselves in this. Well, I can't say like make peace. When I say make peace, whatever. Like, this is the best language I can use at this point in time, because I haven't really fleshed out these ideas 100%. But I can say this, like, from a Jungian perspective, any person that integrates their shadow, any person that is plugged up to the divine child that exists within them, any person that is the expression of their highest self, if you really encountered a person like that, even if you weren't religious, you would wonder certain things about the nature of human existence and what's possible. And they would really make you wonder in awe at their majesty. Now, it's not to say that every person... Well, it's to say this, like, it's all a continuation. So knowledge is a process, existence is a process. All of it is a process. There are some people that will stand higher than others, certainly because everybody's born with a certain, with different distributions of traits. But it's definitely the case that no matter who that person is or what kind of trait disposition they hold, whenever people become, wrap themselves in glory, not in like any superficial way. Like, I mean, I don't know any other language to use other than this religious language, man, but it's definitely the case that, well, we haven't seen them in a long time. We haven't seen it in a long time. I mean, Michael Jordan is the thing that comes the closest to it, like in terms of how people really responded to him and what he was able to do. It's something else, man. It really is something else. Same thing with Barry Sanders, man. It's just like something else. Because not only were they extraordinary athletes, and I mean, they're not the only ones. They're like, when people talk about Muhammad Ali, it's partly why athletes, like really great athletes, are mainly the individuals and figures you see in inspirational videos and things like that. Or like people like Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi or something like that. They're something, we call them great and things like that, and we have so many idioms and sayings about them. But, it's something that Nietzsche felt every person should strive to, and that mankind at some day should become, in whatever way. And eventually, all of that would lead to the dawning of somebody or someone that was higher than all of those things that would make a new kind of game. And who knows what that is, but, I mean, Nietzsche was trying to push out or create a new iterative game that was post-religiosity or post-Christianity, because he believed we were living in a post-Christian world. We were in a different history hitherto than any history that preceded it, and it was a great one, because now the true potential of man could be born, the glory of man could be shown, And I see transhumanism and AI as an affront to those ideals. And I mean, I'm not against AI in the sense that I would love for robots to come about to take away menial labor and things like that. I'm all for that as far as I'm concerned. But not every the idea that they should do our thinking for us, or that people should look to become technology either. I mean, like, we should become something greater than our machines. Like, I don't know. Because greatness isn't just in what one can honestly physically do. To a certain extent. I mean, like, yeah, it's obviously there, but, I mean, human beings aren't just physical things. We're not just spiritual things to a certain extent. We're psychological things, or our spirituality is psychology. We're an amalgam of things, and, I mean, any person that was a shining representation of any of one of those damn things, like, or any of those things all at the same time would just be like I don't know. It's kind of it'd be kind of crazy. I don't know if you can't. I don't know if I could imagine a person like that, quite honestly, because it's an ideal. Who knows really what it would lead to, and who knows what it would really be. But to me, the game of the Ubermensch is a far better one than most of the ideological other ones that we're playing right now. And it's definitely the case that transhumanism and the interest of artificial technology leading to a new god is definitely not the summation or the dawning of the Ubermensch. That's definitely not the case. And honestly, I really whenever I look at people who are interested in developing AI, I do think that we just gave up God to try and make a new God. I mean, like, we give oftentimes when I look at people, whether or not they're feminists or whether or not they're, and I mean, it's not like, some people don't just have a technological interest in AI. And, a lot of times when people are feminists, or when people are communists, or when people are a lot of other things, statists or capitalists or whatever, they just have a different God. They have something else that matters in terms of its magnitude in the world besides the glory of mankind. And in that way, they're just another type of Christian. As far as I'm concerned, or another type of religious person. That's, And I guess what Nietzsche was looking for, and what I'm ultimately trying to bring about, is a new religion. But it's not really religion in the sense, like, there's an ideal. Like, there's an ideal, and it's even echoed in the Bible. Jesus says that there's going to come a time when the true worshipers of God don't worship at the temples. That there's this idea that, well, I mean, man is limited. something that needs to be overcome. It's definitely something that needs to be overcome. And we may not understand what that final thing is, but, I mean, I'm not religious or spiritual or anything like that. I'm just talking in a certain kind of language. But I can see a certain kind of narrative that is definitely been the case that we have wanted to kind of repress our, Nietzsche was too soon. A lot of people were too soon. It's just that, I don't know. I don't know. I kind of feel crazy when I say things like this, but I know, I mean, it's not necessarily, I mean, like, maybe it is a kind of faith. I don't really know. But I know certainly it's the case that, well, the potential for what people could be in this day and age, with all the information that we have and all of the resources that we have, I mean, we could really make greatness reappear in this world in a way like in which we've never seen it before. And I mean, there's a lot of reasons we're not doing it or anything and everything like that, but I don't know. But yeah, so that's why transhumanism and AI can't lead to the Overman, or AI can't be the Ubermensch or anything like that, or a transhumanist can't be the Ubermensch. But we can collectively bring the Ubermensch about if you so care to. But I say I'm a bridge, and I think, yeah, I think that that's the better way of being and doing. Even if I don't necessarily agree with everything that Nietzsche says. I mean, like, I don't agree with everything that Nietzsche says. Don't get me wrong, but like, but I think that better to play out better to play out that narrative than a lot of other ones that have preceded it. So, yeah, that's my video, and thank you for watching.